To get ready to make our spa relaxation soap, I'm going to lay out everything that I need. First, I'm going to have to put my gloves on before I touch everything. And I've made sure that I have one mold ready to pour my soap in. I've also got a liner that I'm going to use to insulate that mold after the soap is poured. I've got my hairnet that I like to wear to keep my hair out of my workspace. And I'll also wear some safety goggles to protect my eyes, as well as use my laser thermometer to measure both my lye and my hot oils, and of course my scale to weigh everything. Now, this is just me. I like to keep things, dishes down. I like to keep the amount of mess that I have to clean up to a minimum. So I have found on a restaurant supply store these great paper buckets that I can use to make my soap, and then I can just toss them and throw them in the trash. I also use these disposable paper cups as well, and that just kind of helps me keep down the amount of dishes that I have to wash when I'm done. So let's get started. We're going to be mixing up 4 different colors. I want to make sure that I correct a color that I used before that didn't give me quite the hue I wanted. So I really wanted shades of blue and green with a little bit of gold, and I got this very dark kind of blue at the bottom. So to correct for that, I'm going to be using a different blue. This blue that turned pretty dark in the soap before is an antique blue. This time I'm going to be using something called Blue Vibrance, and I get that from Nurture Soap. Oops, let me turn that around. There we go. Blue Vibrance is one of the colors that we'll be using. And then the other color is a Aqua Pearl Mica that I get from Brambleberry. The third color is going to be a gold, and you can use pretty much any gold. I get one from Nurture Soap. And then finally, one of my favorite colors, Siren Song. Go ahead and wipe down my mold with some 91% isopropyl alcohol, and I'll also wipe down the various tools, equipment that I'll be using, so you'll see me do that throughout. Now this mold is one of the tallest molds that you can get from Nurture Soap, and I use it because this particular bar is a whopping 7.5 ounces each bar. So it's a very tall bar of soap, and that's why we have to use this really tall mold. Go ahead and leave the recipe for the spa relaxation bar in the description, but we're going to be using 25 ounces of organic coconut oil, 25 ounces of olive oil, 25 ounces of palm oil, and 2.5 ounces of castor oil. We're also going to need 25.63 ounces of distilled water, and I have that as half water and half ice, so it's distilled water, ice, and distilled water. And then we're also going to use 10.95 ounces of our caustic soda, or our lye, sodium hydroxide. I use a food grade lye. I highly recommend that you use a very high quality lye. Now the reason that we use both the ice and the water, many soap makers probably already know this, but it keeps down the fumes as we put the lye into the water, so that we don't have to worry about those caustic fumes while we're making the soap, choking us basically. It's really bad stuff. So it's a good idea to always measure your lye in a separate container than the actual lye water container. So this is my lye water container, but before I put the lye in it, I'm going to go ahead and measure out the ice water mixture, and then I'll measure out the lye, and then we'll put the lye into the water. My mnemonic for remembering this is snow falling on water. So with the lye being the snow, just remember that you always want to add your lye to your water and never the other way around. Here's another tip for making cold processed soap. I like to use sodium lactate. It helps to keep the soap from sticking to the mold, helps it to get out of the mold, but it also helps your bars to get a little bit harder. Now I use mine anywhere from 1 to 2% of the weight of my oils and water, but for this recipe I'm going to use a solid 2 ounces of sodium lactate, and that will go right into our lye water. So after zeroing out my scale, I'll go ahead and measure 25.63 ounces of the distilled ice and water. Next, I'll measure out my lye in a separate container. And finally, I'll measure out my sodium lactate to go into my lye water. Now that everything is measured all out, I'll go ahead and get a spoon and pour my lye right into my distilled ice water, so snow falling on water. And I'll quickly start to stir. Now I'm just making sure to get all of the lye, making sure that it's dissolved inside the water. And I'm doing this by just making sure I feel the bottom of my lye container so that there's no more granules. Once I'm sure that I've got all the lye dissolved, I'll go ahead and pour my sodium lactate into the lye water solution. A quick measure of our lye water solution shows that it's a little too hot. I like to soak somewhere around 120 or lower, just depending upon the mix. And this one's at 155 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm just going to move it to the side and let it cool down while we measure out the oils. So to begin, I'm measuring out some hot melted palm oil. That's going in first, 25 ounces of that. Next, I'm going to pre-measure out my melted organic coconut oil before I add it to my oil bucket. And I'll do the same thing for my olive oil. And finally, the same thing for the organic castor oil. Now, spa relaxation wouldn't be called this if it were not for the essential oils that we use. This is a combination of lemongrass, eucalyptus, and peppermint. You can blend any combination you'd like up to 5 ounces for this batch. It's time to prepare our colors. So now that we have our oils mixed, first I'm going to take these disposable paper cups, and this is just my trick to mixing colors. Every soap maker has a different way of doing it, but I like to measure mica spoons. So I'm going to measure 2 mica spoons, and I'm just showing how I measure out a level mica spoon. I just literally put the spoon in and kind of scrape it on the side and get it as level as possible. So that's 1 mica spoon. And I'm going to measure 2 mica spoons of mica into each of my little paper cups. Here's another method you could use. This is just a chopstick, and I'm using it to kind of level off the mica spoon. That's just another way to do it. Use whatever works for you. Now notice I did not measure out the gold. The reason for this is after I've mixed all of my colors, the gold will go right into my bucket of oils, and I'll color it directly in the bucket. So I won't be using a separate little cup for that. Now, although a little off camera, I went ahead and pre-blended all of my oils so that I would have a homogeneous mixture. And now what I'm going to do is just take 1 tablespoon of our oils and put it right into each cup of color. So you want to disperse your mica in the oil, and that's what we're doing. So now here I'm adding 1 tablespoon of Kaolin Clay. The Kaolin Clay helps the scent in your bar last longer. Did you know that? There's a soapy tip. So So the neat thing about these disposable buckets that I get from the Webstaurant store is they come with these little inserts, y'all, because these are really fried chicken buckets. But hey, they make a great little place for me to put my tools so that I don't have this caustic oil all over my table. Next thing, I'm going to go ahead and put a strainer over the bucket. It's perfectly sized, and I'm glad for that. And the reason I do that is because before I pour the lye into my oils, I want to strain it. Lye has a tendency to not always dissolve completely, so we want to make sure we only get the dissolved lye, and if there are any little bits, we don't want those to make it into the bucket. Now, because I'm making a batch that has a lot of colors, I want to do what's called a light trace. That gives me more working time to incorporate my colors. I'm getting the batch basically emulsed. I've added my essential oils as well, and I'll just kind of stir that till I think everything's incorporated, and now I'm ready to start coloring my batch. As I mentioned before, we want to make sure that we don't overmix this blend, especially after adding our essential oils, causing it to get too hard too fast. So I'm demonstrating how I check for light trace. And as you can see, when I pull up the spoon and I just make these little circles around the batter, I can very lightly see the trace marks left from the drippings that come off the spoon. This is known as light trace, and it's a good phase to be in when you're ready to start coloring soap. Now I'm using the container that I had my lye water in, so I don't dirty any more dishes. And each color is going to get, I'm just going to fill that lye container up with the batter, and then I'm going to add the colors in. And that way I'm not dirtying extra dishes, but I can color each batch as I move along. So the first thing we're going to do is just add, it doesn't matter which color you choose, it's whatever you like. But I am grabbing the Siren's Blue, or the Siren Song, which is this beautiful blue, and I'll basically just, pick a color, scrape that color into the batter that you've sectioned off, and then just begin to mix it. Now, by the time I got to this last color, my soap batter had started to get a little bit too hard to flow. One of the things you can do to get that to soften up is just get your stick blender and lightly just emulse it again. It'll kind of relax, but you don't want to do too much or it'll get harder on you. So once I've got it to where it'll flow, you can see I can now pour it into my mold, and I can keep moving along. Now just a little bit of cleanup and spreading my batter evenly, and I'll tap my mold down to get rid of any air as I poured those layers. A little bit more cleanup, and now as you can see, look how chunky the remaining soap has gotten. That is definitely not what we want. So just as before, we're going to go ahead and try to loosen that batter up by adding first the mica color, and then we'll use the stick blender to kind of help get that to be soft again. It's time for the final touches. So I'm going to be taking the end of this spoon, or you could use a chopstick, and I'm basically going to be swirling in the direction that I'm indicating, excuse me. So yeah, I just take my chopstick and literally just have fun with it. Have fun with the batter. I swirl in one direction, and then I swirl in the other direction, and then I go down and I go back again. That's it. And then once I'm happy with that, I'm going to go ahead and take my spoon and do my characteristic kind of fudge tops, or cake tops as some people call. And after that, we are going to be ready to insulate this batch and set it aside for 24 hours. To help keep down the soda ash, because here in Texas it's pretty humid, which is one of the contributors to more soda ash, I go ahead and spray the top of my soap with an isopropyl alcohol, and then I cover it and wait. Just before I cut this bar, I'm going to go ahead and steam it. Whenever you steam your bar of soap, you help to remove any soda ash that may have occurred during the 24 hours that it was insulated. And it also just gives a really nice luster to the top of the soap.